Welcome to Meet My Inspiration. On this episode, I welcome United Nations Assistant Secretary General, Mr. Satya Tripathi. Mr. Tripathi is also the head of the New York office at the United Nations Environmental Program. Originally from India, he has over 35 years of experience as a lawyer and development economist, and he's been with the UN since 1998. And now, please welcome Mr. Satya Tripathi. Okay, hello, Mr. Tripathi. Thank you very much for joining me for Meet My Inspiration.
Thank you so much. Good to be with you, and thank you for having me.
My pleasure. Could you please briefly describe your current role?
Currently, I'm the Assistant Secretary General of the United Nations, and in that role, I have two hats. The first is that I head the New York office of UN Environment, as you know, UN Environment is the global environmental authority, and it is the environmental lead within the UN system. And the other hat I wear is that of the Secretary of the UN's Environment Management Group, which is a system-wide structure put in place by the UN General Assembly roughly 20 years ago. And the EMG primarily has a membership of about 50 different UN agencies, funds, and programs, pretty much everybody, and also external entities as observers like the Worldwide Fund for Nature, the International Union for Conservation of Nature, and so on. So the role there is to build consensus around key issues of strategic importance to the world's environment. So at two levels. One is internal, as to how we are sustainable, how the UN practices what it preaches. But the UN is not small. On any average year, it spends about $30 billion through its agencies, funds, and programs worldwide. So that's not a small amount in terms of a carbon footprint and also what it does internally. So that's the first. And the second, of course, is externally. What are the key issues and how can agencies collaborate and build synergies so that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. And so that's the other role that the EMG plays. And in my view, I mean, I have been the secretary for close to 2 years now, and what I have seen is that it performs a very strategic function within the UN system. It brings key concerns to the fore, and there's some churning within this UN system. There's a lot of conversations at strategic levels, and then often we find solutions and path forward that is in the interest of course, the UN in its role as a service provider, but more importantly, to the rest of the world in their efforts to find consensus around key strategic issues for the planet.
Okay, very good. Sir, as you mentioned, you've been in your role for about 2 years now. What are you doing differently in this role than your predecessors might have?
Well, my predecessor did a fantastic job, and he moved on to be the chief economist of the UN. So he's still in the UN system. It's not about doing things differently, because I think he did a phenomenal job for his time, because the context changes by the day, literally, in terms of the issues that confront the UN. If you take the example of COVID-19, in December, we weren't even talking about it. We didn't know it existed. And in 6 months' time, it has literally upended the world order as we understood it, with tremendous ramifications, whether for ecology or environment or ecosystems or the planet itself and people and prosperity. No matter what angle you want to analyze the facts from, we have a situation that simply didn't exist 6 months ago. And that's crucial to note, that what you do is important in the context of where you are at a point of time.
Let's talk a little bit about your younger years in India. Where did you grow up?
I grew up in multiple cities in India, in the state of Odisha. It's on the east coast of India, a state of about 50 million people. Quite, I mean, it's not a big state by Indian standards, but quite a reasonably sized state.
And what kind of upbringing would you say that you had?
Well, I had a very, I call it a very creative upbringing because my father was a mathematics professor, and by the time I was born, he had quit that career, or he was about to quit that career, and set out to be a social worker because he believed, and so then he went on to be a journalist and was the publisher of one of the largest newspapers in India, something that was founded before, but he played a big role in its revival. It was founded by a freedom fighter before independence of India, and then of course it had with the death of the founder, it had lost its kind of primary driver. And then, of course, by the time my father got associated with it, it was being run by a bunch of other freedom fighters, which included then the Prime Minister of India
Hmm.
in that group. So he got associated with that group, and then went on to become the publisher of the newspaper, and and that newspaper still stands as one of the very few newspapers in India that have a completely independent way of thinking, and standing up for what is right, and every penny they make goes into charity. So they don't make any profits for themselves. It's a charitable trust. So I grew up in a household like that, which gave me deep insights into the power of information, of course, what the good it does and the bad it does, and what we see now in terms of fake news, and the risks it brings to civil society, and the social construct as we understand it. Um, I understood that 50 years ago, and that I think is a tremendous privilege to grow up in a household like that, where you really understand. It was fascinating that I got to read the best magazines and newspapers of the world 50 years ago, although they would arrive a month later because there were they would normally be shipped, and many and I got to read the New York Times 50 years ago, growing up in a small city in India, because I was part of a newspaper household where every magazine and the newspaper came into the editorial office, which I had access to, given that my father was a big part of the management structure there, and so you get to read everything, which was fascinating.
Hmm.
And so even when India had very little connection to the rest of the world, by nature of the fact that it had just been a decade or two since it was independent and it was finding its feet, and it was still a long way away from where it is now. And so, but I had the privilege of getting access to the best sources of information the world had to offer. And that was fascinating. The other thing I learned was the power of philanthropy. What I'll share with you a story. Many years later, when I was a civil servant in the government of India, I went to meet the judge of a high court uh, because there were a lot of government matters pending in that high court, and of course I wasn't trying to influence the decisions or anything, but you're allowed to meet as a major litigant with no interest in the outcome but that of justice and fairness, to go and meet judges in camera and request that if certain matters that have been pending for a long time could be expedited. So that was the only reason I was meeting him. is to say that, sir, we have about 200 cases pending in your court, and they are of grave importance to the people at large who have an interest in their outcome. So could you kindly expedite their hearings? And he was very kind, and he said, of course, these are important matters, and I'll see what we can do. And then as I was leaving, he said, where are you from? I guess he was trying to be nice. And then I told him where I was from, and he said, oh, I am also from that state. And so he said, what part of the state did you grow up? And I told him where I came from and all. He said, I know your father. And I said, really? He said, yeah, I mean, the trust that owns the newspaper actually gave me a scholarship that got me to law school. Then I became the judge of this high court, which is a rare privilege. I mean, from millions of lawyers, only hundreds ever make it to the high court bench. And I was, that just reinforced my understanding of everything I had perceived as a child, but never seen the evidence of it. And the judge went on to say that, I come from a very poor family in a remote village. And but I knew that this trust gave out scholarships to meritorious students, and so I made the effort to apply, and I went on to get the scholarship, and the rest is history. So I've seen the power of philanthropy and the power of building virtuous partnerships where you can actually leverage not money but good intent and goodwill to produce spectacular outcomes for people and planet.
That's wonderful. That's a wonderful insight. I'm going to move on now to bringing it back to your time at the UN, or bringing it forward rather to your time at the UN. You're an economist and a lawyer with over 35 years of varied experience. You first came to the UN in 1998. What was your initial role, and why did it appeal to you?
Well, I initially came in on secondment from my government. So the role was that of a regional administrator, and I was in Bosnia. But then the secondment ended, and subsequently I went back to the government, and then of course I came back later on employment with the UN, and in that role I was heading the human rights investigation apparatus for the UN in post-war Bosnia, where the office itself had close to 600 personnel to start with, and by the time we ended, it had grown to about 1,000 personnel, and it investigated 12,000 human rights violation cases across the country, and sometimes beyond, because many a times the perpetrators could be in neighboring countries. Because when the war was happening, everybody was converging into Bosnia, and then of course people had moved back or moved on. So finding, to give you an example, when we started investigating the integrity of the personnel that were still employed with the government of Bosnia and Herzegovina, we started looking at small things like, what certificates do you have, because like in any normal country, you would check. If somebody claims I have a degree, then you would check, can I have a copy of your degree? And then where does it come from, and find. And so in many cases, we found that people had certificates, but the school board did not have the records anymore, because a lot of things were displaced during the war. But actually somebody in a third country had those records, because they had taken them away, and they were then verifying and telling, okay, this is a correct certificate, which is as astonishing as it may sound. It was indeed the case, and in many cases we access those people and appeal to their good sense and goodwill to return them to the school board so that those records can be reconstructed. And so it was fascinating, but so was the fact that there were 12,000 cases that were investigated, and based on those results, we were able to vet all public officials in terms of whether they had anything to do with the war, and was that legal. And sometimes you may have everything to do with the war, but you were just a soldier and you were following orders and you're staying within the ambit of the law, whether it is the humanitarian law, the Geneva Conventions, or the national laws. And so long as you remained within the limits of both your national laws and the international laws pertaining to war and humanitarian issues, then you're fine, because then you did what you were supposed to do. But there were tens of thousands of those that were at the forefront of the genocidal war that affected Bosnia for as long as we can remember, and the scars unfortunately still remain.
Indeed, they do. So you've been with the UN for quite a number of years, and you've worked on many different projects and programs and in many different roles. Could you share with us what are some of the programs or projects that you have worked on at the UN that you're most proud of? Maybe something that stands out in your mind the most?
Well, I would say all of them, because perhaps the problem, if you see it as a problem that I'm not able to decide which one is the favorite, the problem is with me, perhaps, because I find it fascinating that somebody from a small town in India has the opportunity of leading some of the most uh, consequence operations of consequence for the world. And I'll explain why. If you take the case of human rights investigations work in Bosnia, where I started my UN career, I see that as absolutely significant and central to building peace. Without accepting what went wrong, we will never change. There will be a facade of trying to change or attempting to change, and all that. But real change happens when we accept our mistakes and internalize them and find ways to heal. And then that's why reconciliation is so important. And so to that extent, my own humble contributions and experiences there are absolutely what define me as a UN official or as an international civil servant. Because I saw, on the one hand, the horrors of what war can do to a once very prosperous country, deeply rooted in European ethos, and just how a few bad leaders can mislead their people into something that the impacts of which nobody has comprehended are understood, and then you are sucked into a mindless war that then defines the life of generations to come. So in that, finding those perpetrators of human rights violations, building on that, and structuring systems that will prevent those kind of violations to recur in that operating environment, and building not a blame game based conversation, because that never helps, but rather a self analysis, how to change yourself by internalizing your own understanding of what went on. And many of the officials that were there subsequently post war, many of them had a lot to do with it, but most of them had nothing to do with it. So for them to understand what was wrong and what must never happen again. And I think to that extent, that was absolutely spectacular. Then another assignment I did was, that I remember, was chairing the committees on laws and treaties for the Cyprus unification talks. As you know, that's a problem more than 50 years old. And when I was involved in it in 2003 and 2004, it was fascinating, because even though there are deeply divided points of view on either side of the island, the Turkish Cypriot side and the Greek Cypriot side, but all key issues, what was very endearing to note, that both sides had the same Cypriot values that they cared for. So in public conversations, of course, there's posturing, and then taking stands that might possibly look intractable. But in private conversations, they all shared the same ethos and same common aspirations for a unified Cyprus. Unfortunately, it didn't come through because it went to referendum and one side voted in favor, the other didn't. But that notwithstanding, I was coordinating the work of about 400 experts in that particular effort from the Greek Cypriot side, from the Turkish Cypriot side, and experts contributed by member states from around the world with a very strict timeline. And then the Secretary General Kofi Annan was very keen on it, and it was called the Annan Plan when it was presented to the people. So that was a very gratifying experience for somebody to be in the center of all that and to be able to contribute. I also worked worked in many places, but I was the UN recovery coordinator for the post-tsunami recovery, where I had the pleasure of working with President Clinton, who was the tsunami envoy of the United Nations. So, and then I was the UN recovery coordinator, managing the nuts and bolts of a $7.2 billion recovery process. And the UN operations was rather large, with about 3,000 staff, 27 agencies, funds, and programs, all coming together, to deliver on a $1.2 billion program just for the UN, but an overall recovery program of $7.2 billion. So the UN had the responsibility of coordinating it at the request of the government of Indonesia and other governments that had an interest in that matter, including donor countries. That was fascinating. And then, of course, I was involved in helping set up finance facilities in different parts of the world. And of course, at that time, this all started as a pro bono effort at the end of 2016, when I wasn't working for the UN, because I was convinced that pilots don't fail because you put a lot of money to make pilots work. Because it's a business model that you're trying to develop. So you put a lot of money into it. So I often say that pilots don't fail, but pilots don't scale, because you will never have that kind of money at scale to roll it out across the landscape. So you have to find business models where you can have billions of dollars invested in protecting forests, in changing the current destructive form of agriculture, where we keep pouring chemical fertilizers and pesticides into Mother Earth, believing that this is the only way we can grow food. And I tell my friends who are on the other side of the aisle that, have you ever been to a virgin rainforest? And if you have, did you ever ask yourself the question, has anybody put a pinch of fertilizer or chemical pesticide into those forests? The answer is an emphatic no. But they are still the most vibrant of living and breathing spaces anywhere on the planet. Why? Because nature is cyclical. Nature sustains itself. Nature fails when humans happen to nature. And that's what has happened with agriculture. And of course, then there are perverse systems built, stacked up one on top of the other. So now that the soil has lost its fertility, and of course we keep needing more and more fertilizers and pesticides, then the insects or the pests, they grow tolerant to the pesticides we use, then we keep making them stronger and stronger and stronger. And that then becomes the endocrine disruptors for our children, and the chemicals that go into our body systems and give us cancer and incurable diseases. And then that's how you keep selling medicines. So we have built a perverse infrastructure, a vicious cycle, as I call it, and we need to get out of that. We need to switch from soil chemistry to soil biology, and that's why organic farming, natural farming is so important for reviving the planet.
Well, so we're starting to see your passion come through for how you feel towards the environment and environmental change. For those that may not know, could you briefly describe the UN Environmental Program and its mission?
The UN Environment Program was set up in 1972. It came out of the Stockholm Conference on Sustainable Development. That's where the countries of the world came together and recognized the centrality of environment to everything we do in terms of our growth models and the prosperity paradigms that we built for ourselves. And so it was in 2022, we'll actually be celebrating the 50 years of the founding of the UN Environment Program. More importantly, is Stockholm Conference on Sustainable Development, which then was followed up 20 years later in the Rio Conference, as we know, the famous Rio Conference, where the Rio Conventions were born, the first being the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, then the UN Convention on Biodiversity, and the UN Convention Against Desertification, the UNCCD. So these were the three Rio Conventions, as is most popularly known. And then there was a Rio Plus 20 conference in 2012, where there were some changes to the world's environmental governance model, where countries of the world came together to agree on a UN Environment Assembly, which is a universal body. Every country is represented there, and everything is decided there by consensus. It meets once every 2 years. The next UN Environment Assembly meeting is on the 21st of February, 2021, in Nairobi. And of course, 1972 was 1945 when the UN was founded, and there were many more countries in the world in different continents that were capable of being a generous host to UN agencies. And Kenya, of course, put itself forward, and the member states agreed to headquarter UNEP in Nairobi. And so that's how UNEP headquarters is in Nairobi, although I am based here because the Secretary General is here and the UN headquarters is here. And UNEP felt the need for senior representation at UN headquarters, but our headquarters of the organization is based out of Nairobi.
Okay. What do you think are the most urgent challenges regarding the environment and climate today?
I think urgent is a misleading term, not in terms of seriousness, because it is urgent. That's not the point I'm making. The point I'm making is that for some reasons, we believe change is good. And we know change is good. We keep telling ourselves that change is the only constant we have in life. And as paradoxical as it sounds, it's a fact. So when we coined the term, and when I say we, I'm referring to the world community, climate change, it somehow does not convey the seriousness of what is really happening. It should perhaps be called a climate crisis, a climate breakdown, a climate catastrophe. Let me explain why. What is happening now is air pollution kills about 7 million people worldwide every year. And these are research data, not speculated information. If you look at the IPCC reports, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, they tell us that, they told us actually that a 2-degree pathway will be something that humans can possibly stay within and still be able to bounce back over the course of a few decades. So if we remain on a trajectory of 2 degrees of global warming by the turn of the century, then we would be fine. But that was based on the information which was available then. But now, the year before, IPCC came out with another report, which basically told us that we need to stay at 1.5 degrees Celsius. 2 degrees doesn't work because the positive feedback loops are reinforcing. And what I mean by positive feedback loops is that if you take the case of the Arctic ice or the Antarctic ice sheets, which pretty much have the potential, even small portions of them have the potential of rising sea levels by 50 feet, which basically means every bit of land that we use to sustain ourselves, our living spaces, our cities, our agricultural land will all vanish with 50 feet of sea level rise. And that is the challenge actually, because we somehow do not seem to understand the enormity of what is happening. Now, if you look at the 2-degree pathway, scientists tell us that the carbon budget for the world to shoot through that possibility is 2,900 gigatons. And we've already spent 2,600. At this time, we're spending anywhere between 40 to 45 gigatons a year, which basically means we have roughly 7 years, by which time it will be impossible to ever stay on a 2-degree trajectory. Then we are done with 2 degrees. Paris Agreement that everybody appreciates so much, everybody talks about it, and rightly so, because it is the first time all the countries of the world came together to agree on something. So that's why it is significant. But the fact remains that the Paris Agreement, if fully implemented, of which there is little evidence at this time, barring a few countries, it will take us to 3.2 degrees of global warming, not 2 degrees or not 1.5 degrees. So, in summary, the Paris Agreement doesn't take us anywhere, even if it is fully implemented. And that is why we're at a point of crisis. And what I would urge your viewers to think what it does to everything they love, because love is a very powerful metaphor for everything we do in life, whether we love ourselves or our children or our parents or our ecosystems or our environment. Love is at the center of it all. And if you love anything, you should be very worried, because we have roughly 7 to 10 years time to really turn the clock back. And that is not as simple as turning the clock back. I'm using it as a metaphor, and this is turning the planetary clock back, which will take every person on the planet to put their own little bit, and that will add up to spectacular results.
Are you optimistic that this goal can be achieved?
I'm very optimistic. We ended up in the moon. Before they started working on it, nobody ever believed.
Indeed.
And so the humans, there's nothing beyond the humans, good and bad. And that is why let's dig deep, find our inner belief, our inner core of morals and values and ethics, and let's pull all of that together. Let me cite a small example of my own self, which I find fascinating. So indulge me for 30 seconds. When I was a little kid and I was growing up and I started shaving, the first day, I had the tap running and I started shaving, and of course my mother watched me, and at that time I was amused she was watching me, but now I understand she must be watching me with horror at the criminal wastage I was indulging in terms of the tap running and me standing there trying to shave. So she didn't say anything. She watched me do that. The next day she came in and she gave me something in the family now is more popularly known as a bucket test. So she brought in 3 big buckets of 20 liters each, and she let me shave as I was. And then as I was shaving, she would catch the water that was flowing out of the tap. And at the end of it, she had already collected 60 liters of water and some more that had been wasted. And then day 3, she brings me a little mug of water, about half a liter water, and she said, let me show you how to shave. And my initial reaction was, how would you know? Have you ever shaved? And she laughed and she said, no, I haven't, but I know how it is done. And so she was very indulgent in that sense, without getting angry at a very stupid remark. She took that on and she explained to me how it is done. And I found it that it is possible to shave with half a liter of water without the tap running and all. And the other day I was talking to my daughter, and she was asking, what is it that you're most proud of from your life experiences? And I told her this, that she's very good at maths, and she did a quick calculation. She says, Dad, it's been more than 40 years since then. I said, yes, it is. And she said, that means you've saved more than 1 million liters of water by not, she said, by not, and I said, being stupid. I'm sure she was saying by not being wasteful or something, but I said, no, by not being stupid. And so a single human action, and that's not all of me, all the resources I use, that's just the shaving. So we have within our powers to change things. Climate change has happened yes, there are a certain set of countries where perhaps there is more resource use than is sustainable, and we can have that debate because a lot of countries engage in that debate, us versus them, and perhaps that is fair from their context. But what is significant to note that every person on the planet can actually contribute to changing behavior, to questioning themselves, and finding meaningful solutions, of which there are plenty. and and actually that will add up to climate action that will actually save us from extinction in a few decades.
Let's hope so. Um, Sir, you often say that if the UN can make itself redundant, then it has done its job. How do you keep yourself and your team focused on this idea?
Well, I say that with a lot of responsibility, and let me explain why. The UN was created by the member states in the wake of the Second World War, and of course in the wake of the First World War, the League of Nations, which then collapsed, and then of course the UN came into being in 1945. And the rationale was that there was a lot of need for the world for having a common voice on a whole variety of issues. World peace, of course, was on the foremost, on the top of everybody's mind. But then there was health, nutrition, education, and the UN has done tremendously well. This is the 75th year of the UN. We're calling it UN 75. And so I often wonder, what can the UN do meaningful in the next 25, 50, 75 years? And actually, it comes at a right time for that kind of contemplation to occur in our own minds, whether it's in mine as an international civil servant, or in anybody that is a stakeholder in what the UN does. And actually, we are at a time, of course, we don't have a war, but we have something, COVID 19, which is the impact is much worse than any war that we can think of in recent memory. We have close to 500,000 people that have perished already across the planet. We are close to 10 million people being infected across the planet. Uh, and, uh, and just the US Center for Disease Control, CDC, just came out with its own study that they believe that the number is anywhere between 6 to 24 times actually of those that have been tested and found COVID positive, which is a very scary situation. That then you're talking about roughly anywhere between 9 to 30 million people. And then that's what it is. And economically, what it had done to the planet is nothing any war had done in recent memory. So it comes at a time when we really need to stop, step back, and think that the whole development paradigm and what can we do differently this time, because the next 25 years will be the most defining for all species thanks to our actions, but most importantly the human species. And how we behave in the next 10 years will decide how the next generations will live their lives. And so any recovery plan, any socio-economic recovery framework that we put in place as communities, as municipalities, as cantons, as counties, as states, as countries, must be anchored in sustainability, because we have a tremendous opportunity to change course. And we will not get another opportunity like this before it all goes south. So I think that's what we should keep in mind in this 75th year of the UN.
Well said. I'm curious, when your time at the UN comes to a close at some point, what do you hope that your legacy will be from your time at the UN?
Well, I'm too small to leave a legacy behind, because the UN is a collective leadership of certainly tens of people like myself, who are providing leadership, at different levels in different organizations. In something like the UN, which is the world's collective voice on a whole variety of issues that is defining both in terms of scope and substance, the legacy of any one person must be seen from the perspective of what was the collective vision, and did you contribute effectively to the furtherance of that collective vision? So that's one part. The other is, did you bring anything new to that collective vision? Did you question the status quo? And did you excite and energize those that are the young people that are coming into the UN to believe in themselves, to be able to speak up freely and independently their thoughts, because that will make the UN a better place. It is the younger voices, it is the new leaders of tomorrow that are coming in today. And how do older people like myself, who are at the apex of the pyramid, excite them, energize them, empower them to be the best they can be? And then I think that's, if you can be a part of that kind of a legacy, then I think you've served your part well.
Wonderful, wonderful. Mr. Tripathi, I think this would be a good place to bring this talk to a close. Thank you so much for sharing your story and your passion and your time with me on this episode of Meet My Inspiration.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, Chris. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
I want to thank Mr. Tripathi for taking the time to share his story and his thoughts with us. He clearly cares very deeply about what he does. I was so impressed by his passion for his work and by his humble nature. If you want to find out more about the United Nations Environmental Program and all that they are doing around the world, please visit unenvironment.org. The UNEP's website has a wealth of information, including updates on the UNEP's 17 Sustainable Development Goals and the UNEP's response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Again, to learn more, please visit unenvironment.org. Thank you for joining us on this episode of Meet My Inspiration, and I hope we've been able to inspire you too, even if just a little. Sometimes that's all it takes to make great things happen.